right, can everyone hear me? Am I on? I hope so. Okay, cool, great. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming out. My name is Keckeisen, as Sam said. I am the local history librarian at the Topeka and Shawnee County Public Library. And tonight I am going to talk to you about the history of the Dust Bowl, particularly in Kansas, but it will also be kind of a study in what the conditions and life was like throughout the area that was affected and also known as the Dust Bowl. But we'll hear from some Kansans who experienced this firsthand. But of course, to start, I can't start with a quote from a Kansan, but it was just too good to not use. Dust. Dust to eat, and dust to breathe, and dust to drink. Dust in the beds and in the flour bin, on the dishes and walls and windows, in hair and eyes, and teeth and throats. This was a description of the conditions pretty readily experienced by everyone that experienced the Dust Bowl, written by Caroline Henderson, who was a resident of Texas County, Oklahoma. Now, a lot of what we get firsthand experience, or a lot of what the nation as a whole learned about the Dust Bowl experience, came from Caroline Henderson's writings, which were published in nationally published magazines. And so she also kept great diaries of all of her experiences, because, being a homesteader out on the plains and then experiencing the Dust Bowl firsthand. But for almost the entire decade of the 1930s, you have to just picture it, an estimated 100 million acres of America's heartland that stretched from about the Canadian border down to about central West Texas was held in the grips of a years-long drought. The once lush grassland that had covered the area for so long, for generations, now resembled a desert. The naturally windy conditions that we all know and love so dear, being Kansans, picked up the fine particles of topsoil and tossed them into the air and created these dust storms that had the potential to blot out the sun. This area of the United States that was affected, as well as the period associated with it, both became known as the Dust Bowl. Now, life for Kansans during this time period was one of extreme hardship and heartache. The crops that they had relied on for their livelihood dried up and blew away, and their livestock became emaciated. Their homes and barns filled with dirt that they could not keep out despite their best efforts. Now, a lot of us think of, when you hear the Dust Bowl, you think of John Steinbeck's novel, The Grapes of Wrath. But unlike what is portrayed in that novel, most Kansas families actually stayed on their land for reasons I'll get into in a bit. But they just kind of hunkered down, they prayed for rain, and they met these almost constant dust storms with a tenacity that you can still see in those living out on the high plains today. Now, tonight, what I'm going to talk about is what brought on the Dust Bowl, as well as conditions that everyday Kansans had to deal with, and the lasting impacts of this event that is considered by pretty much all historians of such events as the #1 weather event of the 20th century. Now, the Dust Bowl was not simply a single stroke of bad luck. It wasn't like Mother Nature just one day decided to, kind of rain on, or lack of rain on everybody that was living out in the high plains. A number of environmental and man-made factors combined in the early 1900s, and it kind of, again, bad joke, but formed this perfect storm that became known as the Dirty 30s. It all began actually way back in the 1800s, when America, the public's idea of what this land was like was beginning to change. Now, when the first white Eastern European descent people started coming onto this area and mapping it, they were less than impressed. Major Stephen Long was one of the first, and his expedition was one of the first to map this area, and he dubbed it the Great American Desert. You can see here on this map, right? American desert, all this whole area west of the Mississippi. And pretty much said that if you came out here to farm, you were a fool. Like there was nothing out here for our agricultural subsistence. But as time went on and the eastern United States became more and more crowded, this area started to look a little bit better. And Americans began to be incentivized to move west from the crowded conditions of the East, not only by the kind of highfalutin idea of the manifest destiny, go west, young man, but also the 1862 Homestead Act, which offered any adult citizen 160 acres of surveyed land. And actually, you didn't even have to be a naturalized citizen of the United States to take part in that. You just had to basically sign a loyalty oath to the United States and say, yep, I've never taken up arms against the country. I will claim my 160 acres. Then in 1909, this is further incentivized when they increased the acreage to 320 acres per person. Most of that land became concentrated in what was known as no man's land. And no man's land was the part of kind of southwestern Kansas, the Oklahoma Panhandle, and the little, they call it the Panhandle of Texas, the little part that sticks up, and a little bit of eastern Colorado. This graphic right here kind of shows the tongue-in-cheek belief of what people were saying about Kansas, that before it had been droughty Kansas, but now it was nothing but, huge, ears of corn, wheat that was as high as an elephant's eye, rain following the plow, all of that jazz. But a lot of this 1909 land that was, 320 acres, what was left at that time period was concentrated in this area called no man's land. And this area, on average, saw only, actually less than 20 inches of rain a year. But people that were looking to own their own little piece of land and escape the crowded conditions back east, immigrants looking to make a fresh start in America, they were willing to take a chance. Now, one particular group of immigrants affected the future of farming on the High Plains in particular, and especially poignant that I should be talking about this in Newton. But in the 1870s, the Kansas experienced an influx of an immigrant group known as the Volga Germans, the German-Russian immigrants. And they brought with them a strain of wheat known as Turkey red wheat. And this wheat was incredibly well suited to growing out here on the high plains of Kansas, where it was dry, it was windy, it was hot, it was cold, the temperature fluctuated all over the place. But this really hardy strain of wheat worked out here like nobody's business. And pretty soon, this one strain of wheat turned Kansas from what had been considered a corn planting state into what we know as the wheat state. And then wheat became even bigger news with World War I. During the war, there was a naval blockade of Russian exports of wheat through the Turkish Straits. And that was wheat that the Europeans relied upon for everything. And they were massively hurting without this crop of wheat coming from Russia. And so America stepped up and began to export massive quantities of wheat. And like any good government at a time of war, they tied the food to the idea of patriotism by saying wheat will win the war. The more wheat you plant, the more you're helping the boys overseas, the more we're gonna, kick the Kaiser. And another way that the government further incentivized this, besides just patriotism, appealing to patriotism, was they jacked the price of wheat up to $2 a bushel, which was double what it had been the year before. And so out in this area of the country where wheat crops were, kind of the main thing to plant, all of a sudden everybody's looking at this going, this is what we got planned. We're gonna get rich off of this. And it did. It became just this huge boom in terms of agriculture in this area. Every farmer was plowing up their fields and their unused acreage to plant wheat and hoping to get rich. And many did. There were many communities in the area that is known as no man's land, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, that became boom towns thanks to wheat. There were people in this area that were all of a sudden, you know, had multiple cars, had, you know, could build very fancy houses, could afford to buy the latest in agricultural technology. One such person was this lady here, Ida Watkins, who was the self-proclaimed wheat queen of Kansas. She boasted that in 1926, her crop of wheat brought in $75,000. That was more than the annual salary of the President of the United States. It was also more than any major baseball player except Babe Ruth made at the time. Good for her. But unfortunately, while farmers were prospering and communities on the high plains were just booming, it was all at the expense of this. This is native grassland. This is a gentleman sitting out on the high plains of Kansas on a field of buffalo grass. And buffalo grass may not look like much, it's pretty scrubby, but it held the prairie together. The grasses here, while they might not be very tall on the top, underneath could have root systems of 5 feet deep or more. And they would entangle with each other and hold that soil in place like a mesh. And as you can see here, you've got your regular kind of native grasses here with this root that goes all the way down. There's actually another picture in this series of a gentleman standing next to him, and he only comes up to about here. And then, of course, the annual wheat crop. And that's about all you get for a root system. Now, this root system, you know, formed this dense sod that really could withstand all of the high winds and the weather fluctuations that the high plains threw at it. But as more and more acreage was cultivated by farmers, particularly wheat farmers, the complex root system that held this soil together just disappeared. By the end of 1931, which is pretty much what most people point to as the start of the Dust Bowl, 30 million acres of the plains had been stripped of this native sod. And it was all too good to last. Now, up until this point, the high plains and the area known as no man's land had actually been experiencing kind of a weird weather pattern for about a decade. It regularly rained more than 20 inches of rain a year. And so everybody thought, oh, this is what's normal. And what they had been saying in the past, that's no. Rain follows the plow, it follows us, we're good, everything's great. But then things kind of leveled out. You've also got the stock market crash in 1929. And with this, the price per bushel of wheat cratered from 2 to 70 cents. And the 1931 harvest, unfortunately, produced a bumper crop, just huge bushels of wheat. There were 250 million bushels that were harvested that year. But that created a nationwide glut. Nobody was buying wheat. Nobody had the money to buy it. And so grain elevators overflowed. And actually, there were several instances of situations like this, where this poor guy is having to dig a path for his automobile through the streets of a town outside of a grain elevator. The grain elevator was full and they dumped the wheat and corn and whatever just right in the road to rot. Farmers were hoping, of course, they had gotten used to a certain way of living, having the latest in technology, agricultural technology, having new cars, having a well-kept home. And they wanted to keep up with this. They wanted to keep at the level that they had been living during the war. And so these farmers saw absolutely no option but to convert even more of their acreage to wheat cultivation, plowing up even more of that native sod. And there were a lot of people, these people were often known as next year people. you would hear them described as next year people, because they were always hoping, okay, maybe next year it's just going to be a little bit better. If I plant more wheat this year, next year I'll be able to get back to where I was. Unfortunately, Mother Nature had other ideas. In 1931, absolutely no precipitation fell in the winter or spring. And it went from bad to worse when the following summer in 1932, a heat wave hit the Midwest, the likes of which had never been seen in, during when we've been recording weather events like this. And it just didn't stop. Over the next several summers, heat records were broken year after year after year after year. And the rain, when it did come, if it came, was never enough to actually do any good, but kind of wet the ground momentarily and then dry up again. So between the heat, the lack of rain, crops were failing, the land was cracking and splitting, and then everybody's favorite thing, the winds came. Now, windstorms on the plains were not out of the ordinary. Actually, in the past, settlers had pretty much seen this, called them prairie snip fits. Prairie was having a snip fit. But it was just a small occasional dust storm, nothing major. But now you're dealing with an area of the United States the size of Ohio that now has none of its native grass to hold that topsoil in place. And so when the wind kicks up, as we all know it does, it removes not only the dried up crops and wheat and corn stalks, but it also picks up the first several inches of topsoil, and it creates these rolling black dust clouds. These became known as black dusters. One of the first recorded black dusters actually happened in southwest Kansas on September 14th, 1930. It started pretty much in Kansas, and it blew into Oklahoma and Texas. And those that experienced it said it was like nothing they had ever seen before. The wind whipped up the dust at about 60 miles per hour, and it had this dark, threatening sky even in the middle of the day. Most hoped at that time, once it had settled down, this was a freak occurrence. It wasn't going to happen again. But of course, they were sadly mistaken. By the end of the decade, the region affected by the Dust Bowl would see an estimated 726 dust storms, or basically 2 years spent in dust. Now, the storms came in all shapes and sizes, and actually there were some people that claimed that they could tell where a storm had originated by its color. Red dust storms came up from Texas. Brown was from Oklahoma, and yellow were from Kansas. And they also had different makeups, of course, depending on the soil that it picked up. There were those dust storms that were made up of more coarser, sandier soils. Now, because of the kind of heft of a sandy particle, these might not get, very high in elevation. They would just kind of stay low to the ground. But unfortunately, what this does do is, because they're larger particles, is they can cut into you and sting. So these were some of the most physically violent storms to be out in. Now, mild storms, could create just a slight haze. We've seen those before, where it's just like, oh, you can kind of tell something's up in the air. Others, like the black dusters, could blot out the sun for hours, making it almost impossible to see. Now, 13-year-old Harley Holiday here was bringing in laundry from the line to his family's farmhouse outside of Dodge City when a dust storm rolled in very quickly on him. And he was trying to get into the house with the laundry. And he later said, I couldn't see anything at all. It was black as night. I got down on my hands and knees and tried to crawl toward the house. I finally felt the porch and reached up and opened the screen door and crawled inside. I gave this talk in Hoisington a couple of weeks ago, and I had one person tell me that they remember their mother telling them that they actually strung a line from the barn to the house in case anybody was caught outside in a dust storm so they could find their way back inside. Now, dust storms caused more than poor visibility blackouts. dust particles would get whipped through the air and would cause a buildup of static electricity. All these little particles just rubbing against each other caused electricity to build up. And this, like, static electricity could short out your car, your radio. It could build up on the horns of cattle and little points on barbed wire fences, and would actually cause them to glow. People remember seeing that glowing during the storm, that the only thing they could see was the barbed wire fences and like the top of the antennas, like affixed to a barn, glowing. Clarence Beck of Cimarron County, Oklahoma, said that you had to be careful when touching a car after a bad dust storm because, quote, the electricity would jump out about 6 inches to meet you and knock you right flat on your butt. Which, you know, I experienced that just from not even 6 inches in the winter time on my car, so I can't even imagine what that would do. But of course, it was the dust itself that was the worst. Dust picked up by these storms, people described as being mostly like the consistency of flour. And so breathing that in was almost unavoidable. A lot of those who lived through the Dust Bowl remembered that they could kind of equate it, that if you wanted the experience of going outside during a dust storm, if you wanted that nowadays, all you had to do was go outside, pick up a handful of dirt and shove it in your mouth. That would pretty much be what it was like walking outside during a dust storm. Now, housewives like this lady would try and keep the dust from blowing into their homes through a multitude of ways. They would wet down towels and stick them around the doors and windows. There was even some, entrepreneurs that were trying to make a buck off of things that used, sold tape that was said to be dust proof that you could tape your windows up with. But nothing kept the dust out. Those who grew up during this time period remembered later on that there was pretty much a fine layer of dust covering everything in the house, especially when you got up in the morning. One young lady I read about said that, if you woke up in the morning after a dust storm, you would lift your head off the pillow and everything else would be brown except where your head was. That would be white. Another young gentleman who grew up in Morton County, Kansas during this time period, Floyd Cohen, later recalled that, or said that to that day when he was interviewed, if he got a glass out of the cabinet, he would rinse it out before drinking out of it, because even in the cabinetry, it wasn't safe from the dust. You pretty much had to do dishes before eating. You had to do them before eating and after eating. It was impossible otherwise to keep the dust off of your stuff. Now, in Kansas, at least 2 entrepreneurs went into business using large carpet sweepers like this to vacuum the dust out of attics of homes and businesses. Now, this might seem kind of comical, but it's probably the one area that a lot of people didn't think of checking. And when the dust got up into your attic and you didn't clear it out, it could cause your ceiling to cave in. So a lot of people tried to, employ methods like this as a way to either suck or blow the dust out of the attic space so that they didn't, all of a sudden wake up one morning covered in, the top layer of their house. Now, during the most intense dust storms, it would be thick, like I said, even indoors. It would still have that haze of it. Like you might not notice the dust coming into your house that was kind of creating that fine level of silt on everything. But during a bad dust storm, conditions inside were pretty nasty as well. And it made it really hard to breathe. Again, we're talking about soil, the consistency of flour. Women would wet down towels and washcloths and whatever else they could get their hands on, and they would put their children's heads, or they would put them around babies' cribs, trying to keep the dust from getting into their kids' mouths. A lot of kids remember sitting around the dining room table during a dust storm with their head covered like they had a cold with a towel just to try and keep the dust out. Unfortunately, this only went so far. And others actually tried wearing dust masks and things of that nature, or wrapping bandanas around their mouths to try and keep the dust out. But Lawrence Vavida, who was a farmer in Meade County, Kansas, who wrote an amazing biography of his time farming during the Dust Bowl, said that, you know, it was all for naught, because even when when you breathe, the moisture from your breath is enough to form a scum of mud between the mask or the nose or the mouth. And I think a lot of us that experience, you know, went through COVID can remember that, you know, breathing with those masks on, yeah, you would fog up your glasses, you would get kind of that just moisture on your face. Well, now add dust. You're gonna basically have a mud pack building up around your mouth and nose. And on the outside, so things were bad in the house, but on the outside, it was, of course, even worse. And farmers were fighting a constant battle with their land. Dust storms could leave behind these huge, gigantic dunes of dust and dirt. One of the largest was actually measured to be about 880 feet long and 36 feet high. If you were unfortunate enough to have left your barn open during a dust storm, when the storm stopped, you might find that your barn was so full of dirt and dust and debris that many farmers thought it was actually better to tear the barn down and repurpose the lumber, or burn it down and start over rather than trying to dig all the dust out. A lot of farmers would try to later furrow or contour, or what was called listing their land, like this gentleman here. That happened, that was in concert with some soil conservation programs that the government later began to develop. But you have to figure out that, like, you know, if you happen to live next to a parcel of land that is either abandoned, or the person doesn't care enough or just doesn't want to deal with trying to list their soil, their stuff's just going to move into your land and all of your work is going to have been for naught. This was often the case too, because there were a lot of, back during the wheat boom, there were a lot of what was called suitcase farming happening, where, you know, young city slickers would buy up some acreage, plant wheat, and then leave. They went back to their homes and they let somebody else deal with actually taking care of the land. And once the prices bottomed out, most of the suitcase farmers said, well, that's not worth my time or money, and just abandoned their land. So you could have just all of, you know, your farm could be surrounded by acres of basically abandoned cropland. Now, during this time period, Kansas actually allowed certain counties to adopt what were called soil drifting resolutions. And actually in Haskell County, farmers were given the right to enter their neighbor's field and work it to prevent soil from blowing around. If they felt that their neighbor wasn't doing their due diligence, they could go onto their land and work it themselves. But then you're just doing double duty. You have to do that to your own land, and you're working your neighbors as well. But of course, you know, dust storms are cropping up so regularly that this is a constant battle. You might do all of this work. Lawrence Fabida talks about this in his autobiography, you know, spending all day out listing your land, and a dust storm comes along and it's undone in a matter of hours. He later said, I had worked incessantly to keep my land from blowing, and no effort of mine had proved fruitful. There were others that tried to find some humor in the situation. There was the oft-repeated joke in this area that there was a Texas farmer who made his way up to Kansas to pay his property taxes, because that's where his farm had ended up. You've got to laugh, or otherwise you're going to cry. Now, the worst dust storm to happen during this period took place in April of 1935. This early in April, about April 14th, dawned clear, which was very welcome to most people in this area, because the several days previous to April 14th had seen constant dust storms. So when the day dawns clear and cloud, like it's a beautiful day, the weather's nice, the sky is blue, people throughout the high plains are thinking, oh my gosh, is this it? Are we done? Are we finally through with this horrible time? So a lot of them flung open their windows to air out the houses, opened their doors, and it was also Palm Sunday. So a lot of them opened up their houses and were like, okay, we're off to church and picnics. We'll come home later and everything will be nice and fresh smelling. It'll be great. But by noon, a small line of haze was spotted on the horizon, and by mid-afternoon, this little haze had grown into a swirling black wall of dust that was blotting out the previously blue sky. Pauline Winkler Gray, who grew up in Meade, Kansas, recalled it was as though the sky was divided into two opposite worlds. On the south, there was blue sky, golden sunlight, and tranquility. On the north, there was a menacing curtain of boiling black dust that appeared to reach 1,000 feet or more in the air. It had the appearance of a mammoth waterfall in reverse. So think of that, like the wind is pushing it up and over. So it's just going, like she said, like a waterfall backwards. Darkness immediately engulfed any town in the 800-mile path of the storm. Almost every account of that day describes conditions so dark that you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. These three pictures were taken by a young gentleman out in Southwest Kansas, and you can see, I mean, this is over just a period of a few minutes. Here's the town, and it just disappears. This is, early afternoon. The storm ended up raging for hours. The sun did not reappear until late in the day. At one point, the U.S. Weather Bureau in Dodge City said the wind was traveling at a speed of 60 miles per hour when it struck. Visibility was reduced to 0 for a period of 20 minutes, after which time visibility was limited to 10 feet or less, lasting 45 minutes. So this wasn't just a very quick in and out dust storm. This thing kind of just sat. A lot of people said that later when the sun did kind of come out, the sky had the look of a bruise. It was no longer the bright blue sky that they had woken up to that morning. A lot of people that experienced this day thought it was the end of the world. People remember their grandmothers and their mothers and fathers just getting down on the floor of the house and praying because they thought, this is it, we're done. All of this, the conditions and the extended blackout led to this storm being dubbed Black Sunday. This is another pretty stirring picture. This was taken in Dodge City at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Those are car lights, and these are like store lights, but otherwise that's it. Now the massive cleanup that was required after black dusters such as Black Sunday, and all of the tales that were being written back east by farmers and farming advocates saying, please, somebody help us. We can't survive out here. We don't know what to do. This eventually led Congress to pass the Soil Conservation Act, which established the Soil Conservation Service. The SCS took lands that were the most wind eroded and actually turned them over to be used as areas to teach farmers how to deal with this constantly blowing soil. So, again, teaching them how to list their soil, how to list their land, how to contour it to keep it from blowing. They also were showing how to reseed areas without crops with the native grasses to try and undo what had been done by plowing them all up. Now, this was not the government's first program to try and help out farmers in the Dust Bowl area. Franklin D. Roosevelt, in his first 100 days, created the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. That later had its own kind of interesting history, but the AAA was one that paid farmers to basically hold a certain percentage of their acreage back and out of cultivation, and let it try and be recultivated by the native grasses and native plant life. Roosevelt also created the Great Plains Shelter Belt program, which was apparently one of his favorites, which encouraged farmers to plant these long rows of trees to act as windbreaks on their land, which you can still see today as you drive along I-70. You can see these random stands of trees, and those are what's left over of the Shelter Belt program. The program resulted in 18,600 miles of shelter belts being planted, comprising 217 million trees being planted by the end of the decade. Another relief agency that I think a lot of us know about was the Federal Emergency Relief Administration and the WPA. Now, the FERA, provided allotment payments to farm families, and that was just pretty much a blank check, saying, we want to keep you on your land, please don't move. We are just going to try and hold you over until this passes. So they could purchase seed and fuel and daily necessities, whatever they needed with money from these allotment payments. The Works Progress Administration, the WPA, also helped employ out-of-work farmers to get a paying job to bring in some form of income until their crops could start bringing in some money again. One of the WPA projects kind of in this area is this old stone bridge. I think that's out in Florence. Which, I didn't put it in my notes, Dad Katie. But this was just a way of, there were a lot of farm families that helped to work on this bridge because it was a way of keeping their family fed. By 1935, the number of families that relied on any form of federal assistance, some form of governmental aid in the area affected by the Dust Bowl ranged between, depending on where you were, between about 25 and 80% of the population. Now back in eastern Kansas, kind of like where I'm from in Topeka, that wasn't a need. But you move further west and it was. Actually, at this point in time, it was a little bit weird because northeast Kansas was actually experiencing deadly floods. And while out in southwestern Kansas, they were praying for rain. But anyway, so a lot of families were relying on some form of federal assistance to get by. And I think this is a testament to just how awful things were. Because a lot of this was pretty much in direct opposition to the very independent nature of Dust Bowl farmers. There's actually one young gentleman recalled about how his father wasn't going to go into the courthouse to get his lot payments. He was a little too proud. And the young boy remembered, well, my mother, she wasn't too proud. And so she said, we need food, get on down there. Now, finally, after almost a decade of drought and heat dust, in 1938, we finally start to see some relief. So actually significant rainfall happens in 1938, and it stays. It continues to be pretty, I don't want to say moist, but it's the rain continues through 1939. By the end of that year, the Dust Bowl has actually shrunken in size. It no longer, is this huge swath of land. It's shrunk to about 1/5 its previous size. And a lot of people that lived through this time period remember that when the rain came, they got down on their knees and thanked God because they might actually have some hope again. Floyd Cohen, who I mentioned earlier, who grew up in Morgan County, said we'd go out in the rain and hold our hands up and let it hit our hands and our face. And we just worshiped that rain because we knew then that we were going to have some crops. But just because the Dust Bowl was over didn't mean that the effects didn't last or there weren't lasting effects to this. After years of breathing in that fine flour consistency dust, those living in the Southern Plains began to develop respiratory illnesses, particularly the young and the elderly. And it came to be called dust pneumonia. And it was characterized by violent coughing fits, high fevers, nausea, chest pain, shortness of breath. And it could be really bad. There were a lot of families that talk about, or people that were young kids that remember that, when they started coughing and running a fever, sometimes that's when their families said, we're out, we're moving, we're not dealing with this. We've got to move them somewhere where the dust isn't. Doctors who studied those that were affected with dust pneumonia discovered that almost all of the patients suffering from dust pneumonia had basically a form of silicosis. And silicosis at this time was more often seen in miners, people that spent the majority of their time underground. But now it was showing up in people that were living, topside in, what was claimed to be somewhere that was good for your health. And it, fine little particles of silica had, basically built up in their lungs. It was irritating the mucous membranes of the lung tissue. One affected farmer, now this might be apocryphal, but I have to tell this story to kind of get across what this was like. But apparently one affected farmer went to the doctor because he was exhausted all the time. He was losing weight, he was exhausted, he was tired, he couldn't breathe like he used to. The doctor took an x-ray and discovered that one of the bronchial tubes leading to one of his lungs was completely impacted with dust. Basically a dust clot in his bronchial tube. A lot of people remember that if they were suffering from dust pneumonia and they started hacking, basically what they were hacking up was mud. Now, in Morgan County, I couldn't get a lot of information about how many people suffered or died from dust pneumonia, but I know that in Morgan County, at least 31 people died from dust-related illnesses just during the Dust Bowl. But they didn't track how many people developed this later on in life or developed something related to their exposure to all of that dust later on. So how many people actually died prematurely from this exposure isn't known. There is a positive outcome to all of this, though. One thing that did come out of the Dust Bowl was the creation of protected grasslands. In 1937, the Agricultural Department spent about $10 million to purchase 2 million acres that they designated as natural grasslands. They were going to save it and make sure that it wasn't touched. The aim was to reseed the locations with the native plant life and save the land from blowing away as badly as it had during the Dust Bowl. Of that 2 million acres, just over about 100,000 were purchased in Morton and Stevens County, Kansas, and that created the Cimarron National Grassland, which is still around today. Now, the drought that created the Dust Bowl wouldn't be declared officially over until about 1940, but at that point, another war had broken out in Europe, and let's just do this dance all over again, because wheat was needed again. And so farmers began to forget some of the lessons and removed their shelter belts and plowed up the acres that they had signed conservation agreements on to plant more wheat. So that meant that actually in 1950, what a lot of people don't remember is that only about 20 years after the Dust Bowl, another drought hit the same area affected by the Dust Bowl, primarily in southwestern Kansas, Colorado, and Nebraska. But luckily this time, people were a little bit better equipped to deal with it. One, we weren't dealing with a worldwide depression. And so people were more financially stable, better able to weather those conditions. Also, agricultural technology had come a long way, and there was now, more ways to, kind of water your crops than just relying on well water or cisterns. But as we have seen recently, southwestern Kansas is once again experiencing an uptick in dust storms. Hotter summers are becoming the norm. The groundwater that comes out of the Ogallala Aquifer is becoming less of a dependent resource. I believe last I was told by one of my participants in Hoisington, Colby, Kansas is estimated to have 19 more years with the Ogallala Aquifer. Maybe even 9, I can't remember, there's a 9. But it remains to be seen if this is going to become a bigger problem. But I think we all remember that in March 2025, national news picked up a story that a major dust storm hit this area, causing the closure of I-70 after a massive car pileup occurred and resulted in the deaths of 8 individuals. So one thing remains true. Whether this is going to happen again or not, everybody's always like, oh, is it going to happen again? Is it another Dust Bowl? Is it that? Is it that? There's no way to know. Dust storms have routinely and drought conditions have come and they have gone from between the Dust Bowl and now. But I do have to end with a quote from the woman that opened my talk, Caroline Henderson. She wrote in her diary that we know that there is all around us land ready to blow whenever the wind rises. So we'll just have to wait and see. Any questions?
The dendrochronology scientists studying previous droughts say that some droughts affected the Southwest, causing Sawsey to disappear.
Yes, I've heard that.
Lasted anywhere from 150 to 500 years.
Yeah.
Much more severe.
Much more severely, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions? Raise your hand and I'll come and run the microphone over to you. All right. Can you raise your hand again? There we go. Thank you.
I'd like to know how many people here lived through the Dust Bowl?
Oh, yes. How many of you have parents that lived through the Dust Bowl? There, yeah. Grew up hearing stories of it, right?
So this lady here said that she was born in 31 and lived through it herself.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I remember.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll turn her up.
Thanks for the visual from March 2025. My parents got stuck in that one when they were coming to Colorado to visit us. Do you know whether, in addition to the soil conservation practices of like shelter belts and that sort of thing, whether we have internalized or put in like practice, like farming practices that are a result of lessons learned from the Dust Bowl?
Yeah, there is a lot of that, a lot of things that we take for granted or that, most agricultural scientists take for granted, like rotating crops. That is something that came out of the Dust Bowl. That is something that they kind of really stressed as a way that if you're gonna grow something, at least rotate your crops through, give certain acres of your land time to recover, and then go back in and reseed it if you have to. So there were a lot of things that came out of a lot of the those programs that were teaching farmers kind of how to hold on. A lot of them also kind of developed new ways of farming for just these occasions because they knew that, everybody knew droughts were going to happen again. Maybe not at this level, but they needed to be ready for it if it happened again. So with the Soil Conservation Service and the agricultural, the AAA, there were a lot of things that kind of went into new agricultural science and then kind of got picked up by the land grant colleges and, because a lot of those were starting to become really big about this time period too, and learning how to be a better farmer.
Yeah, I meant you mentioned the shelter bells.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. What I was wondering, and I don't know how widespread it is, but around this area, there were a lot of hedgerows planted at some time.
Yes.
And do you have a history on when that may be picked up?
Actually, hedgerows, a lot of those kind of, what I know is Osage orange hedgerows. Yeah, that actually comes from even before the shelter belt program. A lot of those were kind of the almost precursor to that. Not only was it a way to kind of keep your land contained, but it was also a way to designate what land was yours. You planted the Osage orange trees around your land, and that way people knew somebody's claiming this. Somebody's here. Don't take it from me.
Several years ago, I went on a conservation tour in a nearby county with my granddaughter's class. And the shelter belts ideally are like 6 different trees wide.
Yeah.
And I forget how many 100 feet. But I was amazed to remember that they stopped the wind for 300 feet.
Yes.
So it really would break up
Yeah, it wasn't
widespread.
just like, oh, we're gonna plant some trees and hopefully that does something. I mean, it would majorly impact weather patterns. It's like with the listing the soil. A lot of people thought, oh, well, this isn't gonna do anything, but even just contouring it that little bit kept it from completely rolling across the land. It was enough of kind of a speed bump to the wind to keep that soil from blowing.
I've been curious about how the Depression affected people differently in Kansas itself. I'd be interested to know, for instance, what the Newton newspapers were reporting about this.
Yeah.
And I say this because I and others have given presentations about the Federal Theater Project.
Yes.
That was one of the arts projects during the Depression. And we were talking about, I had quotations about just dire circumstances.
Yeah.
And a man who grew up in this area afterwards came up to me and said, well, we didn't really have it so bad. We had our farm.
Yeah.
We could raise animals. We always had food to eat. And even thinking about my own family's comments or even some written records about the Depression, it did not seem as though they were suffering too much.
Right. I think that that's an interesting thing is it's almost, it looks worse in hindsight. I think a lot of people were like, we gotta keep our head down. We just gotta go through. And that's actually an interesting point that I brought up kind of early on. But, you know, we think about a lot of people moving to California. You think Dust Bowl and you think, oh, everybody picked up and went to California or somewhere even further west. But for the most part, those were more people that were affected by the Depression or like itinerant farm families or sharecroppers, that sort of thing, that lost that ability for a livelihood. But if you were a farmer and had your acreage, you weren't going to sell that. That is your land. Now, not only is it, you know, your own parcel of land, also nobody's in the market to buy a farm. You're not going to be able to sell it. So the easiest thing is just to stay put. And actually a lot of local communities kind of banded together and started to really work on a system that didn't need to involve money, that didn't need to involve a lot of like the traditional crops that you would have brought to market. I remember that in my research, there was one local newspaper that stayed in business by trading subscriptions for, I think it was like butter. And so you basically paid your newspaper subscription with butter. Or that little, you know, general stores would kind of stop trying to do stuff on credit or stop trying to take things, you know, with money. And it was kind of a take a penny, leave a penny situation where you brought something in and you took something out. Everybody, it didn't devolve into it's every man for himself. A lot of these little communities, these farm communities, knew that everybody was hurting. And so they banded together and were like, we're gonna try and make a go of this, try and make sure that we can all get through this. Mostly I found that in Kansas, a lot of people that left, it was because of the dust pneumonia reasons. It wasn't because of, you know, any actual like, oh, we can't cut it as farmers anymore, we need to move to California. It was more, we have to get our kids out of this situation or they're going to die. But yeah, I think there are a lot of things, I've heard that even with like WPA projects in bigger cities, you know, the municipal auditoriums that were built or the libraries or whatever, is that kind of stuff is like, it was a point of pride. And it wasn't just, we're gonna throw this up and, you know, hopefully, you know, it withstands the test of time. These are works of art that people put heart and soul into and took pride in.
My grandparents were farmers, and my dad said during the 30s, when there wasn't any crops, they could finally take vacation and go to Yellowstone.
Always look down the road.
Not exactly related, but is there any connection to a lot of the bank failures and the condition of farm life at that time, and what was the impact when crops were bad and the bank was gone.
Yeah, so when I will say this, that a lot of the farm communities in the Dust Bowl actually didn't experience the impact of like bank failures until much later than the rest of the country. But when it did, it didn't impact that much because the bank is not going to go repossess land that it can't sell to anybody. Like if the farm is lying fallow and it's just covered in dust, they can't do anything with it. So that's why a lot of people are actually able to hold on to their mortgages and their land because the bank was like, we can't do anything with this. Good luck to you. Now that doesn't mean that things like equipment and cars and things like that couldn't be repossessed, but for the most part, that did, from what I have read, was not the biggest concern.
In the Dust Bowl, as any time, you have a culture and you have all kinds of people. Some of them came out of it wealthy, and some of them had to leave, so on. And it's interesting to me, we talk about these shelter belts. You go on through western Kansas in that area where the Dust Bowl is, there's hardly any trees there at all.
Yeah, I actually, I just got back with my family from a trip to New Mexico. And we actually drove down from Liberal through no man's land. And it's interesting because they advertise things as no man's land down there. And it's like, I don't think this is a good thing necessarily. But yeah, you get to like the panhandle and whatnot, and it's, I mean, they talk about western Kansas being flat, but it's just like, oh, there is nothing. But I think that goes back to where a lot of people kind of went, well, maybe it's not going to be so bad again, and we need to use our acreage. Let's take the trees out. So I think I haven't actually looked into it to see how much of that original acreage of shelter belt is still around today. I'm going to have to do that.
Okay, let's do one last question here.
Last one.
I think as you drive around now, you see more farmers are doing no-till.
Yes.
And that is a way to hold the soil.
It is, and I think I thought it was interesting when I was out in Poyntington, because that's, I mean, you all are only my second time giving this presentation since I got listed on the Humanities Kansas catalog. So Poyntington was my first, and I thought it was very interesting talking to them because I had been a little reticent to be like, oh, are they going to feel like I'm being, blaming farmers or whatever? But they're living it right now. So there were a lot of them that came up and talked to me about what they're doing as farmers in that area to try and keep things from getting as bad as it was back in the 30s. So they're living it right now, and they are doing that exact same thing.
Okay, well, I think we'll cut it there. I'm sure Katie will be happy to talk with you folks a bit afterward here. One last thing, if you didn't on your way in, please feel free to write your name and a way to contact you. We're going to have our summer reading program adult prize drawings tomorrow morning, so you'll have a chance to win if you put your name in the box here. Let's give Katie another round of applause.